At the end of last year, I was talking with a group of C-suite executives from across industries. At the end, they said, what is the one thing you think that we should all do so that we can drive more innovation in our organizations? I know they were expecting me to say something that was connected to technology, a new technology. But my answer was, you and your entire organization has to learn how to solve the right problem.
Welcome to Rise and Stride, where we empower you to take your next step in an ever-changing business landscape. Here's your host, Denise LeDuc-Fleming, President and CEO of the California Society of CPAs.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Rise and Stride. With me today is Simone Ahuja, a Fortune 500 speaker, best-selling author, and CEO of Blood Orange, an innovation and strategy consulting group. Simone has worked with the likes of 3M, PepsiCo, PBS, Best Buy, and others to develop strategies that increase employee engagement and business innovation. Along with authoring 2 books, she has written for various publications, including Harvard Business Review, Business Week, Economic Times, and the Wall Street Journal. I am just so delighted, Simone, to have you with us today, and I'm grateful that you will be able to share all of your insights with our listeners today.
Thank you, Denise. It is really fun to be here with you and see you again, chat with you again.
Yeah, this will be fun. I'm really looking forward to it because you have just so many insights that I know our listeners will greatly appreciate. So maybe we can just kick off with, we talked a bit about, we've talked many times about recruitment, retention, just how do you make sure that the workforce is dynamic, that people really are ingrained in what you're doing and understand where you're going? So employee engagement, I know, is top of mind for a lot of firms. So how do you define employee engagement? How do you make sure that you have a culture that employees really want to be there and the team appreciates the culture in general?
Yes, I think you grabbed a part of how I would define that right in your question. And one of the things that I love to do is make things really simple. So simple that it almost seems obvious. So what I would say is engagement to me means, do people want to play in the sandbox you've built or no? It's very simple. If they don't, that's when we have problems. The question is, how do you actually build that? So the ones who want to play in your sandbox, they feel connected, right? They are willing to dedicate some of their energy and perhaps a lot of their energy to the organization. They feel connected to the people around them. They might be curious. They're more communicative. They really want to be understood and they seek to be understood, right? They care and they're reliable. And those that don't, well, we know that disengaged employees they really drain an organization. And those are folks they're just showing up, right? It's almost like warm bodies. They're there. They might even be negative. They drag the team down. They might be complaining. They may be less than reliable sometimes. They're certainly not bringing new things forward. And that has a tremendous impact on the rest of the team. So it's certainly something to be aware of and something to really pay attention to. Now, the one caveat I want to share here is that sometimes it's easiest to think that the people who are talking the most and raising their voices the most, and even in a good way, are the people who are the most engaged. And that may or may not be true. So I think it's something to pay attention to, certainly, when people are engaged in that way. But I think it's also really important to consider a couple of different factors, like who's more introverted and who's more extroverted. I mean, I think we learned a lot during the pandemic about ways to engage people, making sure that there were, synchronous ways to connect and asynchronous ways to connect or give feedback. And the other piece is, I think, an element, and it depends on how you grew up. So I'll give you an example. I was working with a very, very large retailer with one of their ERGs. In this particular case, it was Asian Americans. Okay, so they're mostly people who grew up here in the US, but they're Asian heritage. And that was very broad, right? So it could have been Southeast Asia, South Asia, it was broadly Asia. And one of the findings we had in this organization was that there was a lack of leadership in general was not very diverse, and the company was looking at why that was. And there was a concern by the people in the CRG that there aren't enough opportunities to advance. They didn't see themselves in leadership. So it's kind of a two-way problem. Now, what was really interesting is that we got into it, we started researching where this problem was coming from. What we understood is that there was a culture of being really confident when you spoke. And I think the parenthetical comments were, even if you don't know what you're talking about. And then there was this other comment about, that's not how I grew up. I grew up to listen. And when I feel compelled to say something that's meaningful to me and others, then I'll say it. And so people would feel like they were overlooked because they weren't putting their voices forward. So that's the one thing I really want to underline. But otherwise, engagement, typically, who's engaged. They're excited, they're curious, they want to play in that sandbox. They're excited to be there. And that might show up in different ways for different folks.
So you said something that, struck me is, how do you bring together those different individuals' perspectives so they can find the place where they can engage? Like you said, you have introverts, you have extroverts. How do you bring them kind of together and have the sandbox that meets all those needs?
I mean, I think this is such a good question, because I think it's very hard. And I think this is why leadership is increasingly difficult. I think it's not easy, but it's hugely important to consider. So I think some of the ways are strategies, right? So for example, what we talked about before, how are we finding ways for our introverts a way for them to add in that isn't necessarily pipe in, at the big all hands meeting, or what other ways are we providing for people who don't want to share in that way? I think the other way is this idea of how do we create less judgment in our environment. So I think we all have heard about this term psychological safety, which is it's very important. In my world of innovation and entrepreneurship, what we know is that teams that have psychological safety, meaning they feel comfortable sharing new ideas, even if it's a sort of out of the box idea or kind of wild, they can share that without feeling like they're going to be judged. Those are the teams that are the most innovative, and those are the teams that have the best business results. And it's definitely not the teams. In fact, Google had a study about this where their teams that were the most innovative weren't the most pedigreed or experienced. It was the ones that felt the most safe working together. So we have to find those opportunities to feel safe. So I think some of it comes from, how do we treat each other? How do we, and everybody has a different approach. How do we listen without judging? I do think that leaders have to take an active role in modeling what this looks like. Whether it's putting out the idea that feels a little uncomfortable, or even being vulnerable and saying, look, I'm not comfortable sharing this, but I think it would really be valuable for us. So I'm just going to put it out there. And teeing up things like that in the beginning of a meeting, just to model that, show the vulnerability, show what the safety looks like. Or one thing that we recommend often is when people say, we don't have time for innovation, what should we do is build it into existing things. It's a way to create some of that safety, is have your leader model it and have other people share. And the caveat, or the carrot, is we're not judging right now, we're just listening. So this is not the shoot that down because it doesn't seem feasible. It's we're going to listen to all the ideas and take them in and let them sink in, which isn't how we operate a lot in this fast-paced environment.
No, it takes time. And I think that's the piece that's difficult, is to sit there and just be quiet. And what you said about being vulnerable is key. It's key to leadership. It really is. But we have to remember to build it in so we have time. You said a lot there, which took a lot of notes, great bullets, but and nuggets. But you said something about building innovation into your world.
Yeah.
And, innovation, you talk a lot about that. We've talked a lot about innovation. I think our firms, our leaders that are listening today, our business organizations, could use some advice on how to innovate. And you said something, it's not like people think, oh, just let's invent a new iPhone, but you have a different perspective that I love. So maybe you can share that with our audience.
Yeah, I would love to. It's completely understandable. First of all, the reason that innovation often feels like, oh, this shiny object, which is kind of my beef with how innovation is approached, is because it feels big and overwhelming. And I think the misconception is that it is just the iPhone. It is just high tech. It is something that's inaccessible. It is something that happens with the people in the white coats and, the organizational elites. And, my research over the last 15 years has been about how do we democratize innovation? And the truth is that most innovation doesn't look like that. Now, is there a place for that innovation? And is it important? Of course, that's not what we're saying. But if we look at a portfolio of innovation, that's a very tiny slice of where innovation lies. In most organizations, innovation is connected to the things we do every single day. And I want to share a definition of innovation with you, Denise, and your listeners, that I think will help people better understand their place and their role in innovation. And that is simply that innovation is about adding value in new ways. What is a new way? So I think the new piece is very intuitive for people. They understand that, but it's not just new. It's new value. And the reason that word value is so important is because that's when I start to see myself in innovation, because value can mean saving time. Value can mean helping our customers feel heard. Value can mean increasing accessibility, reducing friction and frustration. Oh, now I can see. If I'm creating new value in that way, I can see what my role is in innovation. So that's why I love to share that definition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, coming back to the question of then how do we do it, right? How do we actually start doing it? We have a lot of our quote regular work on the docket. So how do we actually start with this innovation stuff? Well, that's the other thing that we work with organizations and help them understand. If innovation is about creating new value, and if innovation isn't a shiny object you're chasing, and it's not the room with the sticky notes or the kombucha on tap, if it's about advancing your existing business goals better, faster, and cheaper, who doesn't want to do that? I don't know any organization that doesn't want to do that. And so the whole point is, people think like innovation, that means we're going to go rogue or go off kind of on a tangent. Not at all. Innovation, especially intrapreneurship. So I love to talk about internal entrepreneurs in an organization. Intrapreneurs are the people who are innovating and they're advancing your existing business goals. And if we think of innovation in that way, what we understand is it really has to be a core competency, and it has to be something that is a discipline. It can't be something that's done on the side. Now, having said that, real life is real, so we keep it real. We make it pretty micro for people. We help them get started in really small ways. So to your point, what can we do? So we love the idea of adding innovation to things that already exist. So we talked about this in a way when we talked about psychological safety. If you have an existing monthly team meeting, can you take 5 or 10 minutes at the start of that meeting and ask people a question? Like a prompt I love to ask is, what is the thing that we do that makes you ask, why do we do it that way? And I've never come across a person who can't answer that question. Be like, oh, I'll tell you. I will tell you. I wondered this I've been wondering since the time I got here. This is what I wondered. Or what is the thing that you're hearing about from our customers? In our innovation, we say end users, because they may or may not be customers and accessing you in a traditional way yet. There may not be an exchange of finance yet, of money yet.
Mm-hmm.
End users could be different stakeholders, but what are the things that you're observing in them that are creating issues that you could potentially address? So I'd love to ask people that question. What are the tiny ways that you can get started? That's a starting point. I can share more about our process, because I do think it's really important to help people understand why it's fundamental, but also why it doesn't have to be massive. And then further, it doesn't have to be complicated or overwhelming either.
Right. Well, I think it's those simple questions, like you said, just even at the beginning of a meeting, why do you scratch your head and think, why do we do it this way? And I feel like the longer you're in an organization, so I always say to anyone who comes in, write down every question you have like this, like why? Because after you're there a while, it's like you lose your kryptonite, like a Superman. You lose your, and you think, oh, we just do it this way, so now we're doing it, right? You lose that, I don't know, just ability to question.
That's exactly right. You lose kind of a discerning eye that has a ton of value. Now, the irony of what you just said, I think what's so interesting about what you said, Denise, is that most organizations don't ask for that. They try to stamp it out. Right? So we're trying to make everyone row in the same direction. This is how we do it. And we're not going to question why, as opposed to you've got fresh eyes, you've got a different set of experiences. How do we actually leverage that to potentially improve how we do things? Now that it to me is how a leader can be really thoughtful and forward looking and can make people feel included too, and feel valued. We actually want to hear what you have to say. We understand that you have a different experience set, and it can help us advance where we're trying to go.
It's like when you, it's interesting when you say that, because when you first join a board, a lot of times they'll say, oh, you sit and listen for the first year. And I'm always thinking, why? Why do you sit and listen? That's when you could really be bold and ask the questions that you wouldn't ordinarily ask. So
it's very, very true. And I think, I think that would be a great practice to adopt for everybody is when you have new people coming into an organization. For example, I have a colleague who worked in a small organization under 50 people who went to a Fortune 25 organization in the same similar role. And she just couldn't wrap her head around the number of steps that it took to do very simple things. And ultimately, in some things she was not successful, and in some she was successful in sort of collapsing some of these long chains that existed just because they existed. Now, it's kind of hard to do that in large organizations sometimes, but smaller to medium-sized organizations will have better luck there. And I think that what you said has tremendous value. It's a great place to start.
It's a good place. We talked a bit kind of in conjunction with this, we talked a bit about solving the right problems. And sometimes we don't go down that path and we end up solving something that doesn't even matter.
Well, this goes back to what you just said about the board, right? So you sit on a board or you go to any organization. This is how we do it, listen in. Because we're often not solving the right problems. We're not solving for a user need. We're backing into our existing models because we don't want to change or we don't know how to change. So that is a huge problem all by itself. And recently, at the end of last year, I was talking with a group of C-suite executives from across industries about innovation. We talked about technology to some extent. I'm not deep into technology, but I have an awareness of how do we leverage it. But innovation at its core isn't just about technology. But we did talk about technology, like at that time, especially ChatGPT was a big, even now, it's a big topic, right? How do we use it? How can we leverage it? So at the end, they said, what is the one thing you think that we should all do so that we can drive more innovation in our organizations? And they were expecting me to say, I know they were expecting me to say something that was connected to technology, a new technology. But my answer was, you and your entire organization has to learn how to solve the right problem. And that is the training that innovation gives you, which I love. Innovation is a very honest process. And I can tell you too, why I really think it's the best leadership development process. But, the leadership step number one, solving a problem is important, but if you're not solving the right problem, doesn't matter. And so in innovation, we always start with a hunch. Well, I've got a hunch that this is a problem. I've got a hunch that our users find it kind of, it takes too long for them to get onboarded with us because of the way they have to upload documents or something like that. And maybe that's your hunch, but after we go through our process, which we love to ask, what are their needs? What are we call it the jobs to be done. So what is the functional need? What is the thing they have to do? They have to get onboarded with us. What is the emotional need? So what's the way they need to feel? And then the social need is, how do they need to be perceived? And once you start getting to those things, you start to really uncover their needs. So maybe in this situation, find is actually, it's not the length of time, it's that it's frustrating, or it makes them feel like they're not technologically savvy because it's too complicated. There are too many steps in between. It's funny, we run an 8-week workshop where we take people from idea, so hunch, proving it out, is that your hunch, which almost never stays the same after we do our little research, doesn't take too long. And then we go through and establish things like, what's the value formula? How much, what is the value of actually going forward with an initiative like this? How do we influence other people to come along with us? And I think the thing that's really interesting is very often what happens if we drill down on what the problem is it's solving for frustration. So, for example, I was working with a media organization that was talking about employee engagement. And when they got down to the bottom of it, it was frustration they were solving. They're frustrated, and we identified why. And in this case, it was something like they didn't have any autonomy to switch schedules without running it up the chain. So I can't go to my kid's soccer game on Saturday at 4:00 because I have to talk to leader X, and leader X is not available in this short period of time. So it was a very simple solve, and they saw some pretty quick improvements by just creating a system whereby the employees could actually make this certain number of switches on their own. So it's often frustration. So we're not always solving the right problem. They might think, oh, well, there are some hunches about, well, it must be the money. They're not being paid enough. Oh, well, it must be because the conditions are like this. No, they just wanted a little freedom. Fair enough.
It goes back to what you said in the beginning about simple. A lot of times the solutions can be really simple.
Yeah, a lot of times they are. Now, sometimes getting there isn't always easy, especially if you haven't mapped out that path before. But when we know, in our process, what we love to share with people is this process of experimentation. You and I have talked about that. I know that you emphasize that in different roles that you have, is how do we take that hunch and how do we start testing against it in tiny micro steps, right? Micro steps that aren't going to overwhelm me. I'm going to list out the steps that I need to get there. And it might take me 15 minutes or less. I'm going to make sure it starts with a verb so I know what to do, because I'm not going to say influence senior leadership. I'm going to say ask so-and-so for introduction to their peer in this department, right? I can get my head around that. I can influence senior leadership. If I had a few minutes right before lunch, I would say, yeah, I'm not going to get to that right now. We try to make it small and make it really clear. And in fact, one thing that I'd love to share with you, Denise, and folks who are listening, is something that we use called it's an entrepreneur's action plan. And it's just a 1-page worksheet that lets people map that out. So what is my path to highest impact? That is, what is the one thing that I can do that would have the greatest impact on whoever I serve? And I think the caveat there is, that's within my sphere of influence. But what is the one thing? Because we often find that innovation often doesn't go well when we're doing too many things. I think there are lots of unclear priorities. I think that's why a lot of organizations had success during the pandemic, is they got pretty crisp on their purpose and their priorities. And then we ask you, who would be on your dream team? Like, who else could help you with this? And then what are the actions you're going to take to get there? Drill them down into very specific bite-sized pieces, starting with a verb. Should be very actionable. Most of them should be small steps. And then thinking about the resources you already have. So not what am I waiting for? What is the headcount I need, or what is the budget I need? What is the thing? What knowledge do I have? What network do I have? What are all the resources that I already have so that I can get started right now? And then thinking about, what does success look like? Because as entrepreneurs, and we're doing things in new ways, we need to define that in advance, because it helps avoid the whole, well, we haven't done that before and we don't know what it looks like. And, you're starting to define what it looks like. So you're basically putting some guardrails around it so people don't feel like you're going off the rails. This innovation is a very psychological event.
Well, and it seems huge. And to your point, it kind of stops you in your tracks. And I pulled off I don't know if it was from a book or that you said scarcity is reframed as abundance. And I think that so much, because during COVID or other times when you are, austerity, a lot of times that creates unique solutions.
100%. That is so true. And it's interesting because my original research was, I started in India, and not in, corporate HQ of multinational X, but, in the rural areas that probably most people haven't heard of, understanding what grassroots entrepreneurs were doing when they were solving problems of really big ticket items like access to affordable healthcare, creating educational access, affordable finance. How do they do it? Well, they say that what is that? Necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
But sometimes scarcity is the grandmother of innovation, because it's like you say, during the pandemic, it's the first time I feel like people in resource rich environments really could understand how to leverage the resources they had in the way that I often see in, let's say, emerging economies, or even in, let's say, folks who are who are living in poverty, or people who've gone through things like the Depression, or the farmers. If you ask people who had grandparents who were farmers in this country, in the US, if most of your listeners are US based, they will tell you those farmers knew how to do everything. And they weren't, they didn't always have to call the vet. They couldn't call the bookkeeper, the IT. It wasn't like that. They probably didn't even know what IT was back then. But they had to do it all. And there was this kind of ingenuity that they had that was so powerful. And for some people, it might be helpful to think of that TV 80s, action hero MacGyver. Remember MacGyver?
Yes, I remember. Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
MacGyver did the same kind of thing, right? What do I have around me? I've got duct tape. I've got floss. I've got gum. I could escape from my hands being tied in the hull of the ship in the middle of nowhere, before the ship blows up. So I think, that's what we have to kind of get to, but it doesn't have to be massive. And I think that's the piece that feels really empowering. And when you understand that there is a process that's step by step, and those tiny steps, I like to say a lot of a little is a lot, whether it's exercise or whether it's innovation, it starts to add up. And what you do is you learn along the way. And if you, as leaders, I think when we're really encouraging that learning, then I think we're going to get to some really good and new solutions, solving the problems that we're really trying to solve in new ways. Because you're going to learn along the way, and then you're going to adjust instead of taking these massive leaps and then being like, well, we rolled that one out. It didn't work very well. It's going to be a lot more like,
It happens.
It happens all the time. So I think actually innovation, in a lot of ways, people feel like it's very risky. And in many ways, I feel like having a 5-year plan these days, to me, that's very risky.
100%. You just don't know what 6 months looks like, let alone a year. Yeah.
Right. You've got to have an approach and a methodology for rapid testing so you can learn quickly and adjust accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. It reminds me of, I don't know where I read this article about it was a Japanese convenience store, like a 7-Eleven. And they did this test, and they put pantyhose in the convenience store, right? And they saw them going off the shelves like hotcakes. And they thought, oh, this is really cool. We're going to put cosmetics next to it, right? But they too had an approach, and they shifted and they tried things quickly. So they put cosmetics there because they thought, oh yeah, this makes sense. They did that, and they sold virtually nothing. They thought, why is this? So they looked at the profile of the people who were buying them, and they were mostly men. And it was after 5:00. So they put beer next to the pantyhose, and they sold that like hotcakes. So it was like, know your audience, know why you're selling it, and make adjustments quickly.
Exactly. This is, Denise, that is the approach to innovation. You just asked, what do they need? Not what do I think they need?
Yes.
Well, what do they need? It's sort of like, when a fast food restaurant was trying to figure out how to sell more milkshakes. This is a true story. It's a large chain, we all know. And they went to consumers and asked, well, do you want a creamier milkshake? Do you think this vanilla should be more vanilla-y? And then eventually this innovation design group went in there and started talking to the customers and, in these open-ended questions, and asked them, well, why are you hiring this milkshake? Which sounds like a funny question, but what it means is, why do you think you get this milk? What's the story behind you and this milkshake? And it wasn't nutrition. It wasn't it wasn't a lot of, it wasn't because it tasted so good. It wasn't a lot of things. What they found is most of the people buying milkshakes were buying them early in the morning. So it had to do with time. Who are they? They're people with long commutes. What was the job of the milkshake? It was keeping them company and kind of entertained over a long period of time on their commute. So they adjusted their model accordingly. They actually started a kind of a drive-through, right, for those folks. So they didn't have to come in. But I think it's really interesting because I think there's always an assumption that we need to disprove it. If we have that kind of humility and then we quickly test it, we can find much, much, much better solutions.
Mm-hmm. I like the humility. I like what you always say. I've heard you say this before about the job of the milkshake. It's just to think about that in that way. It kind of changes the perspective.
It really does. What is the job that's being done? So, if it's in financial services, what does it mean? What are we providing? Are we really providing just accounting? Or are we providing a feeling of confidence, a feeling of security, a feeling, and perhaps a perception that I'm taking care of business for myself, maybe my family, my organization, all the employees we're responsible for, right? There are lots of things that go with your services that are provided that are beyond the superficial. And, that's kind of like, I think I had shared a story with you of my own accountants who were recommended to me by a lot of, there's several other authors, speakers that I gather with occasionally. And they're like, you've got to talk to these accountants. And I thought, why are these people all so excited about their accountants? I mean, I just, it's not my, it just was an experience I'd had, candidly. But then I talked to these folks, and our first meeting was pretty lengthy, and it was amazing. I was fascinated because they used what I would call essentially like an approach of an empathy interview. They asked me open-ended questions. They want to understand our business. Who do we serve? What are our goals? How do you want to feel? And out of that came a lot of insight that helped them guide me later. Not only that, though, it creates a tremendous connection, right? Because when a group is asked, I was so surprised because it was the opposite experience I had had before with my previous accountant, who was an excellent accountant by the numbers, okay? But this group this was innovation because they were creating new value by our organization feeling more connected to them, feeling like we were heard, understanding that they want a more holistic picture so that they can help us grow the business by looking at the story of our numbers, which is a very different approach than send me your your tax forms and we'll get it done for you.
Exactly. Yeah. It's that value, just not a function, but a value, right? From beginning to end. That's a great way for us to, and I could talk to you for hours, but we don't have hours. We have other things we have to do. Can always have you back again.
Sure.
But that's a great way to end, just on, looking at it differently, the service much differently.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's really important for people when you think about if you're in accounting, if you're in financial services, innovation is important in terms of helping design what's next. Understanding you're meeting the needs of the customers of the future, not by assuming what they need, but by asking what do they need, and then having a simple method for figuring that out. And then understanding that it doesn't have to be massive. It can be really, really small. No matter what your role is, you can add a ton of new value, and that is innovation.
Fascinating. We all have our next steps and what we need to do. So
yes, and I will make sure that we share with you a link to that innovation action plan. So if anybody actually wants part of the math, that method where they can just get started, because people always say, well, how do I get started? This is the way to get started. It's really, I think, useful for people. So we'll make sure we share that.
That's great. Yeah, it's helpful to break it down because otherwise you think I have to innovate and it just is too much. So this breaks it, and I have used that. So it's very helpful. Yeah.
Oh, good.
So I just want to thank you, Simone, for being here with us today, for taking time. We look forward to the next conversation.
Me too. My pleasure, Denise. Thank you.
Rise and Stride is produced by the California Society of Certified Public Accountants. To learn more, visit calcpa.org.